Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 45, and we're going to talk about Sun Tzu and a couple of lines from his Art of War and how relevant is it today. So we'll give it a shot. I'm just going to talk about a couple of things. I try to straddle um, the fact that most people will consider that it's about warfare, which is relevant today, but also I try to relate it to the individual and how an individual is supposed to navigate life. First, let's talk about Sun Tzu. The Art of War, it is said, was written by Sun Tzu, but whether it was or wasn't, as I said, it's not really that our concern for this episode. But he was alive 2,500 years ago. He was a traveling advisor. The history of China is full of warfare between the different areas within China is pretty extreme. Uh, most people in the West, we really don't know a lot about it, but yeah, they had warfare conflict for a very long time. And so the art of war becomes a very important phenomena for the people living there. You always want to get an edge over other people. And the thing I just got to say for a lot of non-Asians is that Z, so Tzu, that's not his last name. So Sun would be his name. So some people believe that his name was Sun Wu, but Zi is a title, right? So SunTzu is more closely the way it is pronounced. Confucius, that we say in English, is Gongzi in Chinese. So there's this thing, right? So it's his title. It's like saying Sir John. So you don't say Sir said, but rather it's Sun Tzu, right? I won't go into his reputation, but let's just jump right into the text because I generally get long-winded when it gets to talking about the art of war. First of all, if you think about it, if this was written and was widely distributed and most rulers and their generals had a copy of it, I mean, you can imagine that after, I don't know, a few decades, everyone has a copy of the art of war. So what would give other people an edge? And that's what was kind of always interesting to me. I've never seen it. I didn't read it until I actually had to teach it. And so I got to look at it. And then I realized uh, what it was about. You'll see people in business school, uh, I don't know, in humanities departments, uh, reading this text. For what reason? Well, we'll get to that, right? So what is war? And so if you look at the title, Art of War, so what's war? And most people will go directly to nation versus nation conflict. But if you realize that the more developed a society becomes, there is a period of time where they realize that war is just simply a tremendous waste, that we don't necessarily have to go to war, that if you play your cards right, if you live well, you can actually avoid war. Nevertheless, even in a time of so-called peace, I do believe that there is a phenomena of war, especially if we take a broader understanding of the phenomena of war. And it is a kind of a core characteristic of war itself. We do have expressions today of Cold War versus a hot war, so an actual fighting war versus non-fighting in terms of pulling out the weapons and trying to kill each other kind of war. That would be the hot war, right? So one might be able to reduce war to the concept of competition, right? So in that sense, we're always in competition with everybody else. Now, you might be one of those people that says, oh, I don't like competition, or I don't compete with other people. That might be true on some level, but then not really. If you want to do anything in life, you are generally competing with others because resources are not infinite. And because there are only so many spots in the freshman class of a university, because there are only so many spaces at a company, to fill, there are only so many people that you can marry, right? So even dating, and mentioned this before, but if you are interested in someone and you are hoping that you would marry that person, if you're the marrying type, you know, if that's in your game plan, well, even if it's not, right, you are competing with other suitors to be able to get with someone. So what are you doing? You are competing with other people for the same person, especially if someone is really attractive and um, that person is open to certain kinds of relationships, then there will be more than one suitor. And so in a situation like that, you are going to compete against someone else to be able to have that monogamous relationship, right? So competition, we're always engaged in competition. We're competing against siblings, perhaps. We're competing against our friends, your friends until you're both applying to the same job, right? Uh, we even, some people will talk about sport in terms of civilized combat, bloodless combat, right? And sometimes tempers will flare just like you were in a hot war. So competition is basically what war is, right? Even as you go through life, we're competing against other people who want to use resources for their purpose, right? So we won't talk about air at this point, but let's just say gasoline, right? So right, and we'll table the climate change debate for another day, but let's just say you want to go somewhere and so you need gas. Well, you're competing with other people for the use of that gas. And it just so happens there's enough of it. But let's just say all of a sudden everyone wants to go traveling, gas price starts to go up. And so now people have to compete for that resource. And now that the price is changing, people are reevaluating their goals, how they're going to do it. Okay, so there's competition, and the very fact that there is competition affects everything dynamically, right? Everything is constantly changing and being influenced because of all of the different competitions that we can possibly imagine or not even be able to think of that happens in everyday life. Okay, hopefully I gave you enough to realize that there's competition everywhere. So what about art? So what does art have to do with this kind of potential violence, but also this kind of competition? And so I would ask people what art is, what makes something art? Obviously, the answers are going to be subjective, right? So depending on what you might consider art or artistic may be according to your own personal criteria of what qualifies as being art. But how can we explain art so it encompasses everything? So we know that it is basically an expression of creativity, something that is different, right? So here we have the usual, whatever, boring, no one considers it any surprise when you encounter it. But then if someone changes it, repurposes it, reimages it, or comes up with something different in a certain way, then it becomes art, right? So you can take the mundane, you can take the thing that is very typical, and all of a sudden turn it into a piece of art. Okay, so the creativity applied in competition, this is what the art of war is about. He says in the chapter 1 in the very first line, if you read it, get a copy of Art of War, there are 13 chapters, and each chapter is numbered, I think for our convenience, but they are written very much like proverbs or sort of words of wisdom, and they're listed, so they're numbered. Okay, so chapter 1, line 1, it says the art of war is of vital importance to the state. Now, one might say state, of course, means government, but if we accept this subjective understanding of what art of war is, that is competition, then the individual can be a state as well. So your brain, your mind, the way that you think, the way that you're going to calculate, the way you're going to plan, the way you're going to observe the competitive field and then decide what your moves are going to be. Well, see, that's you. So the individual, the art of war or the creativity of competition is of vital importance to the individual. And what's important there? Information. So if you go to line 14 in chapter 1, you're trying to take into consideration as much information as possible. Not and Sun Tzu goes into moral rules and principles in addition to environmental conditions, right? So on the one hand, you can say that he's talking about the traditional battle, one country trying to kill and conquer another country. Yes, but it also can be applied to the business world, to you trying to get a date with someone that everyone wants to have a date with, right? And so strategy, you need information, information that your opponents, your competitors do not have, which will give you an edge and might give you victory, whereas other people, they will only suffer loss. He also goes on to say that in line 16, that you should seek counsel, but don't limit yourself to one field. And I try to, so the quote goes, while heeding the profit of my counsel, avail yourself also of any helpful circumstances over and beyond the ordinary rules. So what you want is to have as much subjective perspectives, as many, subjective perspectives on a phenomena as possible, to understand it this way, that way, turn it upside down, turn it around, see what it looks like, understand it, and then figure out how to move forward. Part of this kind of competition is deception. And so he says in line 18, we're still in chapter 1, all warfare is based on deception. One might say all competition is based on deception. So you're going to try to hide your intentions, you're going to hide your advantage so that you can keep your advantage over others. Now, one might say, oh, that's not cool. And so depending on your relationship with other people, one might call this privacy, right? What you do in private, well, that's no one else's business. So having the ability to be able to have privacy, this is very important in the whole field of competition, all of the different aspects where you would have to compete with other people for the same thing, whether it's a job, marriage, maybe even war, hot wars too, deception. Now that you realize that deception is a component in competition, that is simply even going so far as to include privacy, well, then you kind of realize where the adversarial relationship is. And we always hear the government talking about national security. What is that? They're keeping secrets from us, which means that there is deception on the part of government with us, which is kind of funny because the government is supposed to serve the public, but here they are in an adversarial relationship with us. I think that's kind of interesting. I can't go over everything. I usually spend like 3 or 4 days in a semester going over Sun Tzu. So I just want to highlight a couple of things as it relates to competition and the individual. So competition is very expensive. And so if you go to chapter 2, he talks about bankruptcy, right? Not only the cost of equipment, the resources you need to produce, and the problem of a long war. And sometimes the competition can sort of redirect your focus, take up all of your time and energy, which leaves you vulnerable in other ways, right? So if you're going to devote all of your strategy in one way, it may leave you vulnerable in another way. Protracted competition always results in poverty for the people. So now we're talking about the traditional understanding of war, but also if you apply it to yourself, I mean, maybe not so much in America, but you go into some highly competitive countries where the population is large, but the job opportunity is not as great. You have a lot of people investing a lot of their resources, that's even selling their house so that they have money to pay for tutors, kind of thing, right? To give your kids an advantage so they can get into school, so they can study, learn some study skills, whatever. And so when you do that, when you invest and divert a lot of your resources for a competition, it may leave you vulnerable, particularly if society changes. Like you didn't foresee that the Fed was going to raise interest rates, for example. And so your plan of financing certain things falls through, right? So because of the way, the longer the competition lasts, the conflict exists, the higher the probability that you might go bankrupt, right? Because of changes that arise. Let's see, I'll skip ahead to chapter 3 is interesting. I'm going to mention this primarily because of the relevance that it has to today and the wars that we're seeing today. But he talks about supreme excellence, right? What is it to be excellent, like an excellent leader or someone who does warfare, that is competition, really, really well. And so this first 2 lines of chapter 3, he talks about supreme excellence, and it goes like this. In the practical art of war, the best thing of all is to take the enemy's country whole and intact. To shatter and destroy it is not so good. So it is better to recapture an entire army than to destroy it, to capture a regiment, a detachment, or a company entire than to destroy them. Hence, to fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting, right? And so what is the goal of competition is preservation of people's lives, right? So you want to compete in a way where you're not destroying your enemy, or you're destroying the very thing that you're trying to possess or achieve, right? We can also see this in war. The US strategy when they begin to attack a country is to take out all of their infrastructure, bomb their power plants, their roads, their bridges, all of this stuff. Why? Especially if the goal is to take that country and to subjugate it, why are you going to blow up all of the stuff that you need in order for the people to be able to live well? And so it's interesting, right? Don't call me pro-Putin, but I knew that the Western media was not telling the whole truth, because you can see what Russia was bombing at the beginning of the Ukraine war. They were not bombing bridges. They were not bombing the power plants. They were bombing only, primarily military, what do you call that? Military related targets, okay? And they tried to do that because they wanted to preserve as much of the country as they could. The Ukraine does not do that. You can see them throwing bombs over in Moscow, blowing up bridges. And so you can see, if we use Sun Tzu, kind of evaluate the strategies of both sides. Now, I'm not trying to say one side is better than the other. My position is that peace, as quickly as possible, please, to reduce the amount of hate, animosity, and vestigial animosity after all the fighting is over, because it will come to an end. Last chapter, and this is the beauty, which is relevant to our discussion in the beginning of this episode. In chapter 5, he talks about energy. And this is what solidifies it for me, that I think my take, my subjective take, interpretation of the art of war has some legs, right? There's some validity in interpreting it as a guide to somehow generate creativity in the things that we do, especially when we encounter a problem. And if you recall, the way I described a problem is that we reached the limit of our knowledge. That's why it's a problem. We don't know what to do. And so how do we get the information that we need to be able to resolve the problem? Well, we need creativity. So reading from chapter 5, lines 7 to 11, he says, there are not more than 5 musical notes. I guess their scale is 5 notes, not 7 or 8 that we have in the West. Yet the combinations of these 5 give rise to more melodies than can ever be heard. There are not more than 5 primary colors, blue, yellow, red, white, and black. Yet in combinations, they produce more hues than can ever be seen. 5 cardinal tastes, and then he talks about infinite flavors, right? And then 2 methods of attack, endless maneuvers, right? And so he talks about this. And so, yeah, everyone sees the materials, the basic building blocks of a competition, of strategy, of military strategy. But how you apply them, how you combine them, by what measure of each do you combine them, will yield a different result. In other words, that's the creativity. I often use sports analogies, but I mean, you can use restaurants. There is something called fusion, even ethnicities that come to the United States, they have to adapt the cooking to use the materials that exist in this country. But also if they open a restaurant, they have to appeal to the taste buds of a lot of customers, right? If you can cater to a certain demographic group, but you're probably going to reduce your revenue. So if you want a broader appeal, then you're going to try to target the taste or the flavor that a lot of people will enjoy. So Chinese food, for example, in Chinese restaurants here in America, they're not Chinese flavored food. In Philadelphia, it was known that there was the Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. I don't know how much longer that will be in existence because people are talking about demolishing Chinatown to build a new stadium. But in any case, there was a traditional Chinese restaurant where mostly Chinese people of a certain ethnic group, right? Ethnic Chinese, they would love eating there because the flavoring is more, Chinese food. And then there is another popular restaurant, which was, patronized mostly by Americans, non-Chinese, because the flavors appealed more to them that way. I've gone to both, and so you can taste that there is definitely a difference. So what am I trying to say? Depending on what your goals are, what you're trying to achieve, you can play the game the way that everyone else is. But if you really are concerned about being victorious, that is fulfilling your goal, achieving your goal, then a little bit of creativity goes a long way, right? And especially if you encounter a problem, a roadblock, an issue that you just simply cannot resolve, a little bit of creativity, shaking up what you're seeing, looking at what you're seeing from a different perspective, incorporating a different methodology. So you've heard me do it a lot in this podcast where I'll use math, I'll use philosophy, I'll use science, I'll use game theory, I'll use anything as a method to help me rethink a situation to come up with a different alternative. And so this would be an argument or a reason to continually open ourselves up to different subjectivities, to be able to listen to other ideas, because it may generate a new idea in our field, right? Reapplication of certain well-known methodologies in a different way, which will generate different results. Okay, so that's it, a little bit taste of Sun Tzu, and hopefully it'll generate and help you, inspire you to come up with a couple of creative ideas in whatever it is that you do in your everyday life. I'll talk to you on the other side of this weekend.